Hello and welcome to Chapter 5 video presentation titled The Management of Project Procurement Risks. This video presentation, just like all video presentations in this course, are based on a book by Quentin Fleming titled Project Procurement Management, Contracting, Subcontracting, Teaming. Upon completion of this video presentation, you should be able to do the following. First of all, explain why risk management is important for project success. Explain how make versus buy decisions are driven by the desire to mitigate risk. Define the following concepts: risk, risk identification, risk assessment, risk management. You should also be able to provide examples of technical, schedule, and cost risk related to procurement. You should also be able to explain why technical risks are considered to be the most serious ones out of the three categories that we will cover. You should also explain how different types of risks are interrelated. In addition to that, you should be able to explain in simple terms overall approach to risk management. List and briefly discuss common techniques for risk identification. Identify the advantages of the Delphi Technique over brainstorming. Explain how interviews are used to solicit and finalize risks. You should also be able to explain the steps used under the Delphi Technique, identify the main output of the risk identification phase, and also explain how risk probability and consequences matrix is constructed. Finally, you should be able to discuss the four main strategies for dealing with risk and describe the mechanisms that can be used to encourage a vendor to come up with a risk management plan. Now, before getting deeper into the subject of risk management in the context of project procurements, let's reflect on some preliminary thoughts that laid the foundation for this topic. First of all, it needs to be said that management of project risk is important for project success. If you think about it, project success in general is typically understood as a situation where everything goes as planned. So by definition, if some of the work items do not go as planned, then it's hard to say that the project is successful, unless you find a workaround for things that did not work out as you were expecting them to work out. So managing risk is the same as ensuring project success. Naturally, risk management should relate to the entire project, not just the procurement part of it. Naturally, there's a risk in all project items, in all work items comprising a project, and all project items are related to the overall project success. On the top of that, the make versus buy decisions are often driven by the need to mitigate risks. For example, critical tasks may be internalized or procured to reduce risks. For example, if a particular organization believes that by internalizing a particular work item in a project, they should be able to exercise tighter control over this work item and decrease chances of something going wrong with this work item, then they will go ahead and internalize it, meaning do it internally as opposed to procuring it from outside. Or on the opposite, if an organization feels that an external organization has more expertise and is more likely to complete a particular work item in a way that meets the quality, schedule, and budget standards or expectations, then they will go ahead and procure this item from outside to reduce risk to the overall project success. Or sometimes a redundancy strategy can be used when an important high-risk item may be both bought from outside and performed internally, so that if one of the channels, one of the ways of doing this item fails, then the other one can deliver, right? So this is for something that is high risk and something that is very critical to the success of the entire project. Also, it's worthwhile to start with some basic definitions before going into the subject of procurement management, because those definitions are fundamental to the entire field of risk management and to the topic of risk management in the context of procurements. The most important definition, the most fundamental definition, is the definition of risk. Now, typically risk is understood as the possibility or probability of a dangerous event resulting in loss or other type of damage. But risk does not have to be negative. Risk can be something positive, meaning associated with the probability of a positive event, something that makes your project more successful or helps you to accomplish a particular task with less money or with less time. So risk can also be thought of in positive terms. Now, it can be argued that the two most important processes comprising risk management are risk identification and risk assessment, or two fundamental processes of risk management. Risk identification is the process of systematically identifying all possible risk events which may impact a project. So this is where you create a list of all the things that can go wrong. Now, risk assessment is one step above risk identification. So once you identify all possible risk, you go through those risks and subjectively determine the probability that a specific interplay of performance, schedule, or cost factors will lead to the originally agreed upon objective not attained. So risk assessment means subjecting your list of risks that was derived as a result of the risk identification stage to a more fundamental analysis where probabilities, consequences, and other important outcomes of the previously identified risks are analyzed and formally captured. Now, risk management is this broad approach. That encompasses everything that we have just discussed. So risk management is the systematic process of identifying, analyzing, and responding to risk. It includes maximizing the probability and consequences of positive events and minimizing the probability and consequences of adverse events to project objectives. So to rephrase that, risk management is all about looking at a project systematically in order to identify, analyze risks, and also in order to develop strategies to respond to those risks. And risk management includes both minimizing chances of something bad happening and maximizing chances of positive events or positive outcomes throughout the duration of the project. Generally, risks associated with internal development or external procurement of work items fall into the following three categories: technical, quality, or performance risks. Those are the risks related to technical characteristics, quality, or performance of the final product or service delivered as a result of a project. Then there are risks related to schedule, meaning to the possibility of going over the originally agreed upon timeline for the project. The third category of risk are related to cost, meaning all the negative events that can possibly increase the amount of money spent on a particular work item or the entire project. We will discuss each of those three risk categories in more detail. Technical, quality, or performance risks are related to the possibility that the item being developed or procured will not perform to the levels needed by the project. A lot of people would argue that technical risks are the most important ones. They are the so-called showstoppers. Again, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If a product delivered as a result of a project does not work as expected by customers, then all other constraints, meaning how much time or money you have spent, they do not matter. Because at the end of the day, time and money are resources that are spent on developing something of value to an organization or to specific customers. If that doesn't happen, then it doesn't matter how much time or money you spend on your product or service that you deliver as a result of your project. Now, schedule risks are mostly related to the possibility of a work item being delayed or taking longer to complete than it was originally estimated. Oftentimes, technical risks will cause project delays. Any faulty technology, any technical difficulties, they typically prolong the time a particular project requires to be completed because there are all those reworks, redons, or simply pauses in the project in order to figure out what went wrong or what kind of technology is causing a particular technical problem and how it can be replaced. Now, sometimes delays are not that important, but sometimes they are. I mean, there are projects that are very time sensitive. Oftentimes, schedule risks are often called the most important types of risks after technical risks. They're probably more important in a philosophical sense. They're more important. Schedule risks are more important than financial risks because money, in a way, is a renewable resource. An organization can earn money. However, time, once it's gone, you can never catch up. I mean, once time is spent, it is spent, and there's no way of replenishing it somehow. Cost risks are related to the possibility that costs of the critical items or any of the items of the project, whether it's something related to actual assets or work. So those are the risks related to the possibility that those items will exceed the estimated budgeted or available cost. Oftentimes or sometimes cost risks are driven by technical or schedule risks. Typically, in other words, if there's a delay or if there's any kind of technical problems, that ultimately translates to a bottom line number. And typically this type of risk are least serious because, as I said, that in comparison to time, financial resources are replenishable. It is time that cannot be replenished. Also, both time and financial expenditures are means to the overall goal of delivering something of value to customers. So that's why both cost and schedule risks are viewed secondary to performance risks. Now, we already mentioned that different types of risks are interrelated. Unfavorable results in any of the three areas, technical, schedule, or cost, may impact the other two categories. For example, technical issues may lead to additional costs or time delays. Or ambitious deadlines or tight budgets may impact technical performance and quality of the final product or service delivered as a result of a particular project. At the most fundamental level, risk management is extremely simple. A common sense approach to risk management is comprised of the following 4 steps. First of all, risks are identified. In other words, the things that you'll be looking out for are listed and formally identified. After risks are identified, predictions are made how probable those identified risks are, and how serious they might become or how serious their consequences are. After risks are analyzed, then decisions are taken on what to do about those risks, and then those decisions are implemented. Now, this common sense approach is also a part of a more formal approach to risk management that is captured with the following 3 steps, and the rest of the discussion is centered around those 3 steps of a formal risk management approach. Step number 1 is the same as in the common sense approach. It's the identification of potential project risks. And then once potential risks are identified, the assessment of the probability of each of the risks occurrence, as well as the determination of the impact or consequences of each risk, should be determined. So this is, all in all, this is the so-called risk assessment or risk analysis phase. So after this analysis, a formal risk management plan is developed to bring all identified and analyzed dangers or risks down to an acceptable level. So this is the ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose of a risk management plan, to make sure that the probabilities of negative risks are decreased to an acceptable level, or sometimes to make sure that possibilities or probabilities of positive risks are maximized. So let's talk about the identification of project risks. Identifying and listing risks is essential for further risk management. Before you analyze risk, before you develop any kind of response strategies, the risks that you will potentially deal with, they need to be identified and listed. Early identification of risks is especially important since risk mitigation often requires funding. So in other words, you don't start looking for additional resources needed for dealing with a particular risk after something negative happens. You need to identify possible negative outcomes early on so that you have enough funds or enough of other resources and you are ready to deal with that risk. The worst approach is to proceed with the project hoping that risks will be identified and dealt with as they occur. While this is possible, it's possible to deal with risks as they occur, this can lead to unpleasant surprises, schedule overruns, and also cost or budget overruns. So this is something that can get your project absolutely out of control and lead to a situation where a project is close to cancellation. So general approaches to risk identification are usually comprised of the following 4 techniques. First of all, working with the work breakdown structure to see whether any of the work items on the work breakdown structure have possible risks associated with it. Brainstorming is another common technique for identifying risks. The Delphi Technique is a more stringent or more sophisticated version of brainstorming with some particularities on the top of what brainstorming does. And then interviewing, a simple approach that can be used either as a research method on its own for identifying risk or in conjunction with any of the first 3 methodologies for identifying risk listed here. So we'll talk about each of those approaches or methodologies for risk identification in more detail. So the first approach is to work with the project's work breakdown structure. Now, by definition, a work breakdown structure identifies all work items for a project. And this includes both make and buy items. So what a project team can do, they can go through both make and buy items for the purpose of identifying potential risks associated with each item in the work breakdown structure. So a project team can go through work breakdown structure one item at a time and ask themselves, okay, so what kind of risks do we see here? What are the things that can go wrong? Or if we're talking about positive risks, how can we benefit from a particular event that may happen in relation to this work item? So this is the kind of analysis that is done in relation to a work breakdown structure. Now, brainstorming is another technique for identifying risk. It's probably the most popular and most useful methodology, not only for identifying risk, but for coming up with all kinds of ideas in the world of business. It's a very common technique for group thinking, for group-based solutions or group-based decisions, and it's used in all kinds of situations and all kinds of contexts, including risk management. So the main goal of brainstorming is to develop a comprehensive list of all risks facing a project. Now, we'll come back to this point, but the central idea of brainstorming is unrestricted flow of ideas in relation to risks. So quantity matters more than quality, at least during initial stages. So the goal is to enumerate all possible risks and not to solve them. In other words, again, the main idea is unrestricted flow of information, of ideas among team members. So you're not trying to solve anything, you're just trying to come up with a comprehensive list of risks. And trying to address risk can stop this creativity, can stop this free flow of information and ideas, and basically eliminate usefulness of this brainstorming technique. So yeah, addressing risks is not required, as this may inhibit creativity. Possible solutions to potential risks that you identify can be created later. When organized, one way to start organizing a brainstorming session is to think about who will play the following three brainstorming roles. And the kind of roles that people play during brainstorming sessions are usually any of the following three categories. First of all, you need to appoint a scribe or a note taker. This is the person who will be taking notes as team members exchange their ideas. Another important role is the role of a facilitator. So a facilitator is like a manager who facilitates the work of the team and makes sure that everybody has an opportunity to share his or her ideas, making sure that nobody dominates the discussion, allowing people to deviate a little bit from the main topic to stimulate creativity, but at the same time bringing people back to the main topic eventually. Making sure that exchange of information are respectful, in a sense that they don't involve insults or personal attacks. So those are the kind of things a facilitator is performing in a brainstorming session. Then you have team members, meaning people who are actually are part of the brainstorming team. They're the ones who are generating and exchanging ideas. So information flow in a brainstorming session can be viewed as follows. You have a facilitator, meaning the person in charge of the brainstorming session. You have a scribe who is quietly, taking notes based on the information or ideas generated by team members. And then you have team members, and here the information flows, they basically go in any direction. I didn't include flows that would go like from this team member to this team member, just to make sure that the diagram is not cluttered, but it's basically like a free flow of ideas from one team member to any other team member. So this is how a brainstorming session looks like. Now, some requirements towards the role of a facilitator. A facilitator first and foremost needs to be a good listener, because his or her job is not really to dictate what kind of ideas team members need to come up with, but it's rather to listen, to understand ideas, and also make sure that everybody, listening not just to one particular person, but to everybody, to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute and you have a diversity of ideas. Another important goal of a facilitator is to keep the session moving. I think it's okay to deviate a little bit and talk about related issues, because maybe this will lead to better ideas in relation to the main issue, but eventually everybody needs to be brought back to the main topic of the brainstorming session. I think it can be argued that the most important goal for a facilitator is to encourage the free flow of many ideas, not just one idea that is generated, let's say, by the most powerful, the most respected team member, everybody has to generate ideas, and this diversity supposedly will lead to a better list of risks or any kind of list of ideas overall. Even unrelated ideas may have value. They should not be immediately discarded, because seemingly unrelated ideas, they may spark creativity or thinking in relation to ideas that are immediately related to the main topic of the brainstorming session. So facilitators should not allow prejudging of newly generated ideas. Again, the goal is to generate as many ideas as possible. They can be prejudged or evaluated later. Because if you start prejudging, then this may inhibit people's creativity or simply willingness to contribute, because nobody likes to be judged in public. Now, some of the tasks or goals of a scribe. The goal of the scribe is to record every new idea on a board of a flip chart as they are generated. Sometimes you may have a scribe who is taking notes for everything, and then another scribe who is trying to identify the most important items from the information exchange. And one way to do it is to have a whiteboard or flip chart right in front of everybody, and as those ideas are being generated, those ideas are captured on this whiteboard or chart. And this output is called the risk register. This is the ultimate deliverable of a brainstorming session related to identifying risk. Obviously, it's hard for one person to perform the role of a facilitator and a scribe, so you need to have at least two different people performing it. Maybe you can have four people. Two people appointed as scribes, with one people taking all notes, and one person specifically identifying risks and capturing them on a whiteboard. When it comes to team members, brainstorming team members can be selected from the project itself. It is important to include a representative sample of people, not just people from a particular area of the project or organization, for example, procurement or technology. You need to have a diversity of views, diversity of opinions, so that's why the sample has to be representative of the entire organization. It is better to have people with approximately the same standing within an organization to ensure a free flow of ideas, because if you include very important, very senior managers or government officials, then people will be very reluctant, first of all, to share their ideas, because they will be afraid that somehow it will be judged by their top management and backfire on them. But also, a lot of people may be simply reluctant to contradict an idea of a senior manager. So that's why if you have senior management as a part of a brainstorming session, then this may inhibit creativity. Research suggests that the ideal size for a brainstorming team or any kind of team is somewhere between 5 and 10 people. If it's less than that, then you may not have the necessary knowledge or the necessary diversity of ideas. If it's more than 10, then things become very difficult to manage. If you do need to include more than 10 people into this exercise, then what you can do, you can break people down into sub-teams, and then whatever the outcome of sub-team sessions are can be aggregated at a general team session where a representative from each sub-team is present. Some rules for brainstorming session. They need to happen within a specified time period, for example, 1 or 2 hours. If it's less than that, then there may be not enough time to generate a comprehensive list of risks. If it's more than 2 hours, then it may be too exhausting. People don't want to participate in those exhausting sessions. Some ground rules for brainstorming. All ideas are welcome. There's no such thing as a bad idea. Creativity, thinking outside of the box is encouraged. And quantity is preferred to quality, at least at the initial phases. In other words, the goal is to generate as many ideas as possible. Those ideas can be evaluated later. Each team member should get an opportunity to make a suggestion. Nobody should dominate the discussion. And also team members should accept other team members' suggestions and build upon them instead of judging them. So those are some of the most important rules for brainstorming. Now, another technique that we'll talk about is the so-called Delphi Technique. Originally, this was developed as an approach for forecasting future events by Rand Corporation sometime in 1960s. Here, Delphi Technique is discussed in relation to project risk identification, and you can think of a Delphi Technique as a modified or more sophisticated brainstorming methodology. So what is Delphi Technique? Delphi is a structured interactive method used to gain a consensus position from a group of experts on any given subject. Team members can be experts in the area where the project is conducted, or actual members of the project team, or you can also invite experts on risk management to offer their expertise in relation to risk to team members, to the members of the team project. Just like in brainstorming sessions, an impartial facilitator should be selected to help the team of experts to formulate their position. And typically, a facilitator should start the discussion, should start the collaboration by preparing some kind of list beforehand. For example, if we're talking about risk management, then the facilitator can prepare a preliminary list of risks, or a preliminary list of questions that will be asked to identify those risks. Like, for example, questions can be in relation to work items in the work breakdown structure. Like, for every work breakdown structure, a facilitator can ask, so what are the negative things that can happen in relation to this work item? What are the things that can go wrong? So there's some preparation involved on the facilitator side to get the discussion going. Then during the actual session, responses from each individual member are solicited, and they're solicited anonymously, so that each response is only so individual members' responses are only known to the facilitator and not other team members or experts. So there will be no interaction among individual experts. Questions should be directed to the facilitator. It is believed that by isolating inputs, influence of strong personalities or senior positions will be eliminated. So this is the, I guess, advantage or improvement of the Delphi technique over the brainstorming. And then questions I ask the same questions that the facilitator has prepared, I ask several times. In other words, there are rounds or iterations in the process. So a facilitator may prepare like a preliminary list of questions, and then based on those questions, there will be like a preliminary risk register, and then questions can be asked one more time, and then during the second round, the risk register will be refined, and then after doing a few or a couple of iterations, the facilitator will stop the Delphi session if he or she feels that a common position has been developed. In other words, asking questions, additional rounds of questions do not lead to any new ideas, and the team seems to be converging on a common list of risks. So this is the essence of the Delphi technique: going through iterations, isolating input from individual members to prevent convergence of ideas or groupthink, and then after a few iterations, a common consensus is developed on the risks facing the project. So schematically, a Delphi session can be depicted as follows. You have team members or experts, and they all share their ideas with facilitators for several rounds until facilitator develops a comprehensive list of ideas on which all the team members seem to converge. So this is the essence of the method, and this method relies on the following specific steps. First of all, selecting a facilitator. A facilitator needs to be an expert in data collection or Delphi technique, but not necessarily the project itself, because the goal of the facilitator is to facilitate exchange of information and not necessarily to somehow evaluate or contribute to this session from the knowledge side. But of course, it's useful when facilitator understands the context within which a Delphi method is used, because this will help the facilitator to understand better the ideas generated by the members and also see better whether team members seem to converge on a list of ideas or not. Then a panel of experts for the project is selected. Typically, the team participating in a Delphi session is comprised of key people from the project itself and some outside experts, let's say experts in relation to a particular technology or risk management. A preliminary list of risk criteria will be formulated by the facilitator and then the project manager or the project manager to get the discussion round started. So that's what I was saying. It's either like a list of ideas or a list of questions or both. So some obvious risks can be included during this stage, just to eliminate the need for the team members to discuss the obvious, or just to simply to help them get started. Then the facilitator transmits the risk criteria to the panel of experts by mail, telephone, or email, and asks them to anonymously rank and return the preliminary risk criteria according to some designation, such as a very critical risk or some somewhat critical risk or not a critical risk. Now, when those preliminary lists of risks or criteria are sent out, each expert is encouraged to introduce his or her own risks or criteria to the list. Based on the input, the facilitator will generate a new list of risks and together with their rankings, and then send it out again. The steps will be repeated until the facilitator feels a group consensus has been reached in terms of the list itself, what kind of risk needs to be included, and also how those risks are prioritized. In other words, the importance of each of those risks. Interviewing is another popular technique. It involves simply talking to people, either comprising the project or technology or risks experts. Most of the time, people related to the project or even unrelated to the project, they have valuable knowledge or experience to share. Sometimes customers can be interviewed as well. I'm talking about project customers here. So interviewing can be used as a technique of its own to identify new risks or to assess the risks identified previously, or in conjunction with other techniques such as brainstorming or Delphi Technique to get a better understanding of those risks and their probability, their consequences, and what can be done. The most important deliverable or outcome of the risk identification phase is a list of all potential risks facing a project, including risks related to procurement. Once all of the potential risks facing a particular project, whether those risks are related to procurement or not, are identified, the risks need to be assessed or analyzed or evaluated. So once all risks are listed, which is a result of the risk identification phase, the project team members need to come up with the following for each of the risks. First of all, estimates for risk probabilities, in other words, how likely this particular risk to occur. And also estimates for risk impact or consequences. In other words, if this risk occurs, what are the consequences and how those consequences will impact the overall success of the project. Now, these two measures are important and also interrelated. One cannot be considered without the other one. For example, just because the probability of a risk is very small, so the estimates of the probability is low, it doesn't mean that this risk can be ignored, because the consequences can be very high, right? If this risk indeed happens. So that's why one cannot be considered without the other one. Once you list all the risks, you can calculate the so-called importance index for each of the risks by multiplying its likelihood or probability expressed as a decimal on a scale from 0 to 1, and also the consequences also expressed as a decimal on a scale from 0 to 1. Now, people are usually bad with numbers in the sense that they cannot think in terms of specific numbers, decimals, or probabilities. So to assist them, what you can do, you can create a qualitative scale that is nevertheless attached to specific numbers or decimals. So when asking team members to assess both the likelihood or probability and consequences, you can ask them to select any of the following 5 options, from very low to very high. So the likelihood can be very low or very high, and then there are specific values being assigned to it. And then the consequences can be very low or very insignificant to very high or very significant. And then again, there can be a specific decimal attached to each of the choices. So this will help team members to quantify their expectations in relation to the likelihood and consequences. Then, based on this input, risk probability and consequences matrix or table can be created. So here, as an example, you have the following risk: software vendor going bankrupt within the next 5 years. Now, the probability of this event, this risk can be very low, estimated at 0.2 or 20%. However, the consequence can be very high, estimated at 0.8 or 80%, because if this happens and your project relies on one particular vendor to build a particular IT solution, then once the vendor goes bankrupt, it messes up the entire project, and you're not likely to succeed with the project as a whole. So that's why the compound risk score is 0.16, which is calculated by multiplying probability, which is somewhat low, by the consequence, which is somewhat high. Now, when it comes to dealing with risks, the ones that you have analyzed, there are 4 generic strategies. Avoiding the risk, meaning trying to change the project in a way where the risk is not likely to happen. Transferring the risk, meaning rearranging the project in a way or introducing some legal mechanisms where the risks, either in whole or partially, is transferred from your side to the side of, let's say, a partner or a vendor. Mitigating the risk, in other words, doing something that will decrease the chances of risks happening, and accepting the risks. In other words, having a plan where if nothing works out and the negative event or the risk happens, what will be the plan B? What will be the workaround? What will be your plan if none of your strategies for mitigating or avoiding or transferring the risk work and you have no choice but to accept it? We'll discuss each of those 4 strategies for dealing with risk in more detail. Avoiding the risk. Sometimes the scope of the project can be changed to eliminate non-essential items that nevertheless carry risk. And that, of course, requires negotiation with the paying customer, the party for which your project is initiated. So some items can be simply eliminated to make sure that they don't introduce any risk, any unnecessary risk to your project. Some technical risks can be avoided by staying away from the state-of-the-art technologies and using proven commercially available components. Sometimes this accomplished by working with experienced proven vendors such as Microsoft or IBM instead of conducting open bidding that can help find potentially useful vendors that are nevertheless are risky. They're dark horses in a sense that they're not tested, they're not proven over time. I think for many years a lot of organizations, they have this motto that you cannot go wrong with Microsoft or IBM. Their solutions are widespread, they have been around for years if not decades. So a lot of organizations, they chose to work with proven vendors with respected brand names, so that a lot of the risks that typically originate from working with new vendors, unproven vendors, are eliminated. Sometimes using highly experienced and qualified people can help avoid risk, maybe not avoid, but at least reduce risk. Alternatively, a company can do a lot of research and a lot of planning on their side to make sure that whatever procurement partner they're working with, that partner does not introduce substantial risk to the project. So this is done through the internal analysis by analyzing requests for proposals to make sure that enough information is solicited so that most of the risk is eliminated. But again, it's no matter what kind of, unless there's a drastic change in the project scope, completely avoiding risks is not likely. I mean, you may reduce it to a negligible probability, but completely avoiding is not possible, no matter how much time you put into analysis and planning internally. Transferring the risk, that's another technique for dealing or strategy for dealing with risk. Sometimes a joint venture can be formed. In other words, a partnership can be formed between you and between your organization and another organization, so that risk is being shared equally. If something goes wrong, then the downside, meaning the expenditures, the reputation risk, will be shared equally by the partners. Now, some projects go back to their customers with the list of risks initiated and ask for relief from those risks by changing the scope or renegotiating the contract, so that not all of the risks are actually dealt with or bared by the performing project team. There are legal mechanisms for that. For example, there are certain contract types like fixed price that will transfer all of the risks back to the seller. So for example, to limit your risk, you will say, okay, this is the fixed price that you will pay to a particular vendor, and if the vendor faces some difficulties, then all the extra funds will be spent by the vendor and not by you. However, I mean, it may sound like a good deal to you, but you need to understand that this will limit flexibility of both the buyer and the seller. The seller, meaning the vendor, the organization that is selling something to you, they may make poor choices just to make sure they're within that fixed price. Okay, and that may not be in your best interest, so you may lose as a buyer as well. Sometimes contracts have a liquidated damages provision in a contract. In essence, these are penalties if the seller does not perform as promised. And again, if something goes wrong, then it will be the seller paying for it, not you. But again, you need to think about how it will damage your situation as well, because you don't want to put your seller in a situation where they're afraid to make to make wrong choices, and they're afraid to report back those wrong choices because there are liquidation damages. So there needs to be like a fair provision where the damages, the downsides are fairly shared between the buyer and the seller. Mitigating the risk. Mitigating risk means reducing its likelihood, doing something to reduce its probability or likelihood. One way to do it is through redundancy. Additional testing, proofing, or prototyping is done to make sure that the probability of something going wrong with the final product or service are greatly reduced. Other common techniques for risk mitigation include employing experienced personnel. Again, they may not help you to avoid risk 100%, but they can bring the likelihood of each risk down. Using only proven suppliers or vendors, and also providing incentives for suppliers to perform well. This is something that will reduce some types of risks. Finally, accepting the risk. That's the final approach that we'll discuss. This approach is often used when everything else fails. Sometimes risk simply cannot be eliminated or even mitigated. In such case, a contingency plan will be made. Of course, contingency plan means some kind of workaround, plan B, if this risk actually materializes and it looks like we cannot reduce or mitigate it. What are we going to do as a team? How are we going to deal with that situation? Obviously, such risks that cannot be avoided or mitigated have to be monitored constantly. Project managers often scrub other areas of a project for money and other resources to have some room for maneuvering in case a contingency plan needs to be carried out. So there needs to be some room for maneuver in terms of the scope, the time and cost in case an unavoidable risk happens, and then resources from other areas have to be scrubbed in order to address the situation. Now, regardless of which strategy is used, nowadays a lot of organizations, they are requiring their vendors or sellers to participate in risk management. Now, most sellers, they want new business. Most industries are competitive in a sense that sellers or vendors are competing for clients. So it's not unusual for buyers to require a risk management plan from sellers as a part of an RFP, request for proposal response. And here you have a typical outline for a risk management plan that a vendor must submit as a part of their response to a particular contract that is posted by a buyer. So you can pause this video for a minute and read the items that typically go into a risk management plan.